Hi, this is the Kevin Bass Show. In this podcast, I'm going to be discussing the latest new trends, investigations, discoveries, and controversies in the fields of health science, nutrition, fitness, and medicine. I am both endlessly overjoyed by the discovery of new knowledge and incredibly happy to share it with you, but also relentlessly critical of anything that is unlikely to pan out or unlikely to be true or useful. Through this dynamic interplay, I make this podcast one of the most intellectually exciting and vibrant among any in this space, both tremendously respected as well as reviled by other prominent health influencers and popular media icons. I draw upon my extensive network of scientists, influencers, thinkers, and thought leaders to bring to you a distilled version of what I believe is the proper take on the latest new ideas and trends in these fields. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Kevin Bass Show. A bit about my background and a disclaimer. I have nearly 20 years either studying medical science or being in a laboratory conducting medical science. Nonetheless, I am only a MD PhD student. I'm not yet a medical doctor, and even if I was, nothing that I'm discussing here would be medical advice, simply a interpretation of the medical literature by a person who reads voraciously and thinks incessantly about how to think about scientific problems and their practical application to health. Correspondingly, you should only take this as such, and always, if you have an idea that you take from this podcast that you want to apply to your own life, you should always talk to your doctor before doing so, and never construe anything you hear as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the Kevin Bass Show.
Hey everybody, this is Kevin. The way that I'm recording this is a little bit different than usual, so bear with me. Hopefully it works out. This video, I'm going to talk about Dr. Paul Mason. He's a doctor in Australia. I'm going to debunk one of his book chapters that he wrote and also challenge him again to a discussion, a friendly and civil discussion, a discussion not based in controversy or debate. I'm not interested in having a debate with Paul or anybody else, really. I just want to talk about his chapter. And here's the context. So Paul says, unfortunately, Ethan Weiss is pulled out of the debate. So Ethan Weiss is a cardiologist, or formerly a cardiologist at UCSF, a professor at UCSF for a few decades, is my understanding, who, he was a scientist and a physician who prescribes low-carb diets for his patients, who helps people with low-carb diets, and who has a company based on low-carb diets, or maybe has sold his company at this point. But Ethan wanted to debate Paul because Paul released an article with a bunch of other health influencers that was about why people don't need to take statins. That's very oversimplified that what the article was about. It's a little bit deeper than that, but I want to oversimplify just for the purpose of this video, because if I don't, we're going to go down a really long tangent on LDL cholesterol and statins and cardiovascular disease, and we don't have time for that right now. So what I'm going to do instead is talk about how, we're going to talk about this debate and we're going to debunk his book chapter. So he says he felt it would be unproductive, given my request that he read our paper, that he admits to ridiculing, so that we can address the points of science it contains. Ethan Weiss, please reach out if you change your mind. So, Ethan backed out of debate, and I believe that Dr. Lipid, who's Thomas Dayspring, a widely recognized expert on cardiovascular disease, lipid management, medical management of cardiovascular disease, also criticized the paper, and also he didn't want to debate Paul either. I think basically the reason these men don't want to debate Paul is they don't have a lot of time. They're very busy. They have other things that they would rather do. I, too, am very busy. I, too, would rather be doing other things, but I got dragged into this partly because I thought it was just wrong. I thought it was wrong the way that he framed this. I don't believe that Ethan finds that it would be unproductive to have a debate because he'd have to read the paper. I don't think that's the reason why Ethan said such a thing. I just think Ethan doesn't have the time. So he's just saying it's unproductive. He just doesn't have time. He doesn't want to deal with this. But I think it's worth addressing. So one of the things I've been doing on my podcast is trying to have people with different opinions than mine, even people who I agree with. I can question them, and we're going to have a podcast coming up soon with Kevin Folta, who I agree with on a lot of things, pretty much everything, and I think he's a scientist in the same way that I'm a scientist. But I'm going to go, we're going to dig into the science with him. And that's what I wanted to do with Paul here, because after I saw this, I was like, you know what? I don't think this is the real reason Ethan is rejecting this debate request. I think the real reason is just Ethan doesn't have time. So why don't I sit down and talk with Paul? And I said, I would be glad to have a good faith discussion. So this is what I quote retweeted. I said, I would be glad to have a good faith discussion with you about the details and strengths and weaknesses of your paper on my podcast. Not a debate, but we can politely disagree. Send me a DM and we can set it up in the coming month or two. And he says, he didn't do a thread correctly. Trying to figure out how he replied to this. He says, there's a few things. I'd be interested to know where you stand on it, Kevin. Debating someone like Ethan or Thomas Dayspring would add value for the audience as they could evaluate the scientific underpinnings of both perspectives. All LDL bad, not all LDL bad. If you disagree with the substance of the paper, then that could be a useful discourse. Please review it first and see if you believe there have been any errors of science. So far, so good. But then he makes a turn. He says, in the meantime, you have promised to review my academic paper, chapter on nutrition and provide substantiation for your vitriolic criticisms. You claim hundreds of errors of science. To my knowledge, you have yet to identify a single one. I would appreciate you doing this first. Okay. Alternatively, if you have a change of heart and now believe this is academic chapter be scientifically accurate, you should set the record straight. And I replied to him, I'm not interested in providing a comprehensive rebuttal of that chapter, but I can go over it with you on video. I've offered several times now to go over it. So every time I engage with him, he brings up these criticisms of this particular book chapter, and he basically keeps me from engaging him in any way possible. This is the way I'm interpreting it. For whatever reason, in my opinion, it's because he's afraid to actually have a discussion on video with me. He's afraid to actually have a good faith discussion with me because he knows that he doesn't have to necessarily have control. Whereas with me, it's okay for me not to have control over a discussion because I don't care where it leads. I just want to, find the truth. I just want to have a discussion and we'll see where it leads. I'm interested, I'm curious and open, but I think he doesn't want to have a discussion. So every time I talk to him about anything, have a discussion about him with him about anything, he always says, well, didn't you make this criticism of my book chapter? You should address that first. And he knows that I don't want to address the book chapter because it's the number of criticisms I would have to make it's hundreds. And so therefore I don't want to do it. But my friends, this is what I'm going to be doing in this particular video. I'm not going to be doing hundreds of criticism. We'll be taking on a few topics, but then systematically showing how his chapter does have hundreds of errors. But I said, I can go over it with you on video. I can make my case and you yours. As you recall, we agreed to this earlier, but our moderator fell through in the meaningless drama. We can do it right this time. So I'm being very optimistic. And he says, given that you claim it has hundreds of errors, you have publicly committed to reviewing it, including harvesting many email addresses in the process. I haven't harvested any email addresses. I don't have any email addresses. Like they're somewhere, but I'm never going to use them because that's not my MO. I don't make any money from this. So it's a weird thing that he writes that. And why do you not want to comprehensively review it? Is it because your claim was a complete fabrication? If so, fess up. So he's being very confrontational here. And as I said in this particular YouTube video that I'm going to be doing in this podcast, I'm going to be comprehensively debunking his book chapter. So he's going to get what he has coming for him now. But it's quite irritating because he's basically just like trying to avoid having a discussion. And I said it would take an incredible amount of time for me to do that in writing, which I don't have. We can do a decent job on a one-on-one discussion if you have interest in that. Alternatively, you can talk about it off record over Zoom, et cetera. See, so I'm making the offer to talk to him live in private. I wanted to talk to him in private about the book chapter, but he won't talk to me about the book chapter. Instead, he wants to constantly bring it up and use it to prevent me talking about anything else. So he says, why would it take an incredible amount of time if as you claimed it is littered with hundreds of errors? well, because it's littered with hundreds of errors. What's your... this is something I'm not understanding. He says, should be like picking flowers in a meadow. I frequently find mistakes in publications. A minute later, I've popped on Twitter with a reference. Easy. Okay, so I respond, because explaining depth to my satisfaction takes a lot of time. Fact-checking with a very fine-tooth comb and coming to definite conclusions is very time-consuming. Talk with me on the phone and I will show you, or don't, my man. The difference in the way we fact-check is exactly at the heart of the issue I have with your chapter, by the way. And so this really gets at the heart of the problem with his book chapter and why it's not good and why it's littered with hundreds of errors. Look, and by the way, I want to again preface this one more time before I dig in and start being super honest and brutally blunt. And again, I don't want to do, and I want to say, I don't want to be doing this. I don't want to be doing this video. I don't want to do this video. It's not in my interest to argue with him. I don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy this sort of like weird antagonism. I dislike it tremendously. I really dislike this. But he's saying things that are just not true. And so I'm going to go correct them. And if there's a back and forth about it, I'm probably just going to bail. I'm probably not going to respond or go into detail. People who watch this video, who understand this video, who take the time to listen and understand what I'm saying, will see that I'm right. And the people who, just want to be right and they don't want to listen, they don't have to. So the people who are important will understand. The people who are not important won't, right? The people who are intelligent will get it. The people who are not intelligent won't. And so it's okay either way. And I'm not going to engage in a big, long, drawn out argument about this, but I am going to debunk his book chapter. And the basic problem with it is that he's very superficial in the way he uses his references. He basically doesn't think very deeply about his references. He doesn't think very deeply about how he could be wrong. And he selectively picks references and doesn't think very deeply about what they mean or how they put together in a specific story and how he might scientifically criticize his own story so as to make it stronger. I don't think he has a really strong grasp of how science works, namely the process of being impartial and trying to test one's own ideas to try to show that they're wrong. I don't think he does that. I think he has a particular perspective that he wants to push. He's not very well informed about the scientific literature. He picks and chooses the reference that support his point of view, and he doesn't try to ask where he could be wrong. And because he doesn't try to ask where he could be wrong, he misses a massive amount of information that if he actually paid attention to it, would significantly make more complex his story, to say the very, very least. Now, that is the problem with this chapter. The problem is that whenever he fact checks anything, it takes like 5 minutes to do it. With me, fact checking something takes a couple hours. Fact checking 3 facts takes 3 hours for me. And I'm going to just fact check a few facts here. We're not going to get to 3 hours, but we're going to get to a substantial period of time. And the way that we're actually going to fact check this without fact checking the whole thing and taking forever to do it, which again is very different from the way he does it, which is the whole problem with this chapter, because he doesn't have a deep understanding of nutrition science because of his particular approach. The way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to go over the first page. In fact, that's just the first section on the first page, the introductory section on the first page. I'm just going to systematically show that it's misleading, inappropriate, filled, and riddled with errors. And by showing that with the introductory section, I claim that the entire rest of the book chapter is filled with these very same kinds of errors. Now, here's the thing with this particular podcast and this particular debunking. I'm going to extrapolate from the first section of the chapter after I take it apart and dismantle it. And I'm going to say the whole rest of the book is the same way. Okay? Now, after I do that, I'm going to then give this to Paul, and he can do with what he wants. If he says that the whole rest of the book isn't as bad as the first introduction of the book, then we're good. Then I'm going to do the next section, right? I'm going to do the dietary guidelines section. And then if he says and I'm going to take that apart and show that that's systematically low quality. And then if he says that no, it's just the introduction to dietary guidelines, the rest of the book chapter is good, we're going to just keep going until he admits that maybe I have a few points, right? So maybe I have a few points. He doesn't have to accept everything I say, but he just has to acknowledge that I have a point of view that does see hundreds of errors in his chapter. And this is a legitimate point of view, and I can explain it very clearly and transparently here. I've already offered to do so with him over the phone, over Zoom, etc. And now because he won't accept that offer but continues to not have a discussion or debate with me on any of these other issues. And again, I don't want to have a debate. I just want to have a discussion, a civil discussion. Because he doesn't want to do that, then I'm just going to go ahead and debunk his chapter, and then we'll see how he responds. Maybe he won't respond at all. I'm guessing he might not respond because I just don't think he wants to know that his chapter is filled with these problems. And I don't think he knows, by the way. I think he really has a simplistic understanding of how science works, and he thinks that his book chapter is awesome, even if it's not. I think that's what he thinks. All right, cool. So let's start. Chapter 6, Nutrition for Health, with Paul Mason and Daniel Freeman. And of course, this is in Brukner and Khan's Clinical Sports Medicine. In Volume 2, it is the 5th edition of Clinical Sports Medicine. Okay? So, this is Chapter 6 in the Volume 2 of that particular book. And it starts, let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. Now, we're not even into the main text, the body yet. We're just starting with a quote. But interestingly enough, and this is a very important point because it sets the whole stage for the whole rest of the chapter. Let food be thy medicine is a fabrication. It's not anything Hippocrates ever said. Okay? Now, when they cite Hippocrates saying, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food, they don't provide a citation. They just assume that it's correct, right? They assert a fact as if it's correct, even though it's not. And they don't provide a reference. They don't fact check their own fact. And this is the core of what is wrong with this chapter. Everything in this chapter is simply here to tell a story that supports their particular narrative, and it's not about having a critical understanding of nutrition science, okay? It's about making things that sound good a part of a big story that they're telling in this chapter. So, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food is trying to lend legitimacy to this idea that perhaps food should replace medicine, or food is the main kind of medicine. Let's make medicine actually about nutrition, right? The best way to have nutrition for health is to really place a lot of emphasis on it. And in fact, it's as good as medicine, and it should be used in place of medicine. Okay. Well, so it's highlighting the importance of food as medicine, going all the way back to the father, the grandfather, the godfather of medicine, Hippocrates. The Greek Hippocrates living on the island of Kos. And in fact, he wasn't just one physician. This is an important point as well. He wasn't just one physician. He was many physicians, a group of physicians who all wrote under the name of Hippocrates, even though it wasn't one particular person. In fact, we call it the Hippocratic corpus. The classicists, in fact, do call it the Hippocratic corpus. I was once an aspiring classicist, in fact, and I could read actually a good portion of the Hippocratic corpus in the original Greek at one point. But it's called the Hippocratic corpus, and it's not just one person. But that's an aside. The point, though, is that it is a fabrication. We know that with this one particular text by Diana Cardenas. It's called "Let not thy food be confused with thy medicine." The Hippocratic misquotation in Clinical Nutrition Espen. Methods, examples of publications gathered from Medline and Google Scholar databases which cite the phrase verbatim and attribute it to Hippocrates were selected. Then an extensive review of the works related to food and diet in the corpus Hippocraticum, which is the Hippocratic corpus, because it's not just Hippocrates is the body of work. Corpus means body. An extensive review of the works related to food and diet in the Corpus Hippocraticum was made in order to search for the phrase. So they looked through all of the works in the Corpus Hippocraticum to see if they could find the phrase. And the results were, at least in the last 30 years, this phrase has been mistakenly helped scientists confirm the importance of food to health and highlight new ethical challenges in medicine and dietetics. We showed that at least one biomedical journal per year has cited the phrase. This literary creation has led to an essential misconception. For Hippocrates, even if food was closely linked to both health and disease, the concept of food was not confused with that of medication. So this is nowhere to be found in the Hippocratic corpus. These people searched this, and I've searched this as well. In fact, I've searched for this in the Hippocratic corpus. I've also actually searched very, very extensively for discussions of fasting in the Hippocratic corpus, and I have a critical discussion of that as well. Should come out in a review over the next year or two. It's simply not there in the corpus yet. Confidently, it's cited at the very beginning. Again, this is the lack of scholarly rigor. I think it's found in the very first quotation in this chapter. It's assumed that Hippocrates said this. Hippocrates never said this. Nowhere. Okay. Let us now talk about the first section. So we've already dismantled the very first set of words in the chapter, not even in the body of the text. The first quotation, it's a fabrication. It's not real. And it's the first thing in the chapter. It's not going well already, okay? But we're going to keep going because Paul wants me to do this because he thinks that I'm not telling the truth. So I'm going to do this now. So a healthy diet is one that optimizes health by providing all essential nutrition while also maintaining an appropriate weight. Yeah, sure. That sounds good. Providing all essential nutrition while also maintaining an appropriate weight. It optimizes health by providing healthy nutrition, not necessarily essential. Just providing all essential nutrition, it shouldn't be enough because you can provide all essential nutrition to mice, for example, and restrict the amount of calories that they get, but it's not necessarily the most healthy diet if it's a strictly purified diet. In fact, in the absence of fiber, mice they die earlier. In the absence of fiber, they have a higher incidence of cancer in the absence of fiber, and many purified diets that don't have fiber are not as healthy for mice as diets that have fiber. So it's not just a diet that provides all essential nutrition while also maintaining an appropriate. It provides all optimal nutrition. So the first sentence is already false because essential is just the bare minimum. We need more than the bare minimum to have a healthy diet. So I already think that the first sentence is inadequate. It's not a correct characterization of what a healthy diet is. So that we'll say that's error number 2. So first sentence that we have, let food be by thy medicine, medicine be by food, is a fabrication. Second sentence, I think, is an inappropriate and inadequate definition of a healthy diet. So we've got 2 sentences, and they're already both, in my opinion, they're erroneous. They're both wrong. First, because it's a fabrication. Second, because it's just an incorrect definition. Okay, so let's do the third sentence. The composition of such a diet, however, is subject to vigorous debate among both experts and lay people. That's a very vague sentence. I can't say it's necessarily wrong. Okay, fine. Since it's a vague sentence, I can't say it's wrong. Okay, well, we'll just say it's a vague sentence. Therefore, I can't really evaluate it. So even in the 21st century, we're going to go on to the 4th sentence, even in the 21st century, folklore and conventional wisdom continue to shape mainstream nutrition beliefs in the absence of convincing evidence. Folklore and conventional wisdom continue to shape mainstream nutrition beliefs. What's a mainstream nutrition belief? Is it among lay people, like non-scientists? Yeah, of course. Folklore and conventional wisdom shape mainstream beliefs on everything. Because, there's folklore and conventional wisdom. Of course, it's going to shape mainstream beliefs. That's what kind of the basis of mainstream beliefs are. Then you have science that comes in to kind of correct some of that or provide some correction. And then you have the residuum of folklore and conventional beliefs that continue to linger despite the corrections by modern science. And that's just how beliefs work. So is he talking about mainstream nutrition beliefs among scientists? Because otherwise, this is just, yeah, of course, this is just how it works. Okay, I'm not really sure what he's saying here. So again, it's kind of an unclear sentence. If he's talking about among scientists or lay people, if he's talking about lay people, then yeah, it's a commonplace. It's a triviality, of course. It's okay, but whatever. This is in part due, we're on to the fifth sentence. This is in part due to the difficulties and expense of performing suitable interventional research. This is in part due to, yeah, with nutrition historically based on less robust epidemiological research. Yeah. Difficulties and expense. Yeah, you can't, difficulties and expense. So you can't like lock people up in cages for their entire lives and see what happens. If you feed them one diet versus another diet, you can't do that because, humans are not mice. And then you can't, and then if you tell them what to eat, and then, eat only pancakes and then you eat only waffles, right? One group eats pancakes, one group's only waffles. Well, you can't enforce that necessarily in a free living people. So then you're stuck with the situation where you can't enforce these dietary interventions in free living people over a really long period of time. And if you want to enforce these things, then you can't do that for ethical reasons. So that's the basic struggle. There are some interventions that can last for several years, but then again, it gets very expensive. And so we run into that problem. And unless it's designed perfectly, absolutely perfectly, you can run into issues of interpretation, which is what we have for a lot of long-term randomized controlled trials in nutrition. So therefore, we base our views on epidemiological research. And it is less robust. It doesn't help us with causal inference as well as randomized controlled trials do. So actually, I would agree with that. So the one sentence that so far, I think this is the sixth sentence. The sixth sentence I agree with. The other sentences are either wrong or they're vague and unclear. But the sixth sentence, yeah, it's basically right. Now, here's where we get into some trouble. Findings from these observational studies are often demonstrated to be erroneous when tested in randomized controlled trials. Now, what does often mean? What does often mean? Does it mean more often than not? Does it mean sometimes? Does it mean usually? What does often mean? It really depends on what often means. But I think what he's saying here with this sentence is that findings from let's reread it. Findings from observational studies are often demonstrated to be erroneous when tested in randomized controlled trials. And let me check one moment that the camera's still working. Well, the camera's still working, and we're only 25 minutes in. That's great. It's going to take an hour. Findings, whatever. Findings from observational studies are often demonstrated to be erroneous when tested in randomized controlled trials. I think the implication here is that we can't trust observational studies. But let me ask you a question. If everybody has to eat, let's say you have to choose between pancakes and let's go back to pancakes and waffles. You have to choose between pancakes and waffles. And you don't have any idea what you're going to do. No idea whatsoever. But you have you have observational studies that you know are correct 60% of the time. So you have a 60% chance if you choose at random. You have a 60% chance. Sorry, if you follow the epidemiology, you have a 60% chance of the epidemiology being proven later on by randomized controlled trials. What do? It's better than 50-50 chance, right? Right? So in that case, you choose the epidemiology unless you have a really good reason not to, right? If you have good beliefs or a strong personal reason not to, or a strong scientific reason not to, you can override the epidemiology. But if you base policy on epidemiology that's 60% right, then more often than not, you're going to get the right answers. Does that make sense? Does this make sense, guys? Why is that not acceptable for drug trials? Because drug trials are not, it's like, because in drug trials, the risk is much higher and you don't have to take the drug. With food, you have to eat. You have no choice. You have to eat something. And if you can have something that slightly greater than chance provides some signal that you wouldn't have otherwise from any other basis of evidence, you want to use that evidence that provides that signal. So all you need is to beat chance for observational studies to be useful. All you need is some signal. All you need is for nutritional epidemiology not to be completely noisy, and then it's useful. That's it. That's all you need. And we can call this the Bass argument for nutritional epidemiology, because I haven't found anybody else who makes it. And I don't know why, because it's so obvious to me. It's like, you don't need nutritional epidemiology to be better. I'm going to stop touching the microphone. I realized I was touching the microphone. You don't need nutritional epidemiology to be better or as good as randomized controlled trials for drugs. Nutrition is different from drugs because you don't have to take a drug, but you have to eat. Because you have to eat, all you need for nutritional epidemiology is something better than chance, some signal. It'll help. Policy. So does that mean we can always trust epidemiology? No. Not always. But it's better than not having it if it's better than chance. If you get something better than chance. That's the core argument here. And I've never seen any of the haters of nutritional epidemiology ever address that argument. I don't think they've thought about this clearly. Okay? So even if it's often wrong, all you need is for nutritional epidemiology to provide some signal to be helpful, to be able to help inform nutrition policy. Okay, so I already think that this is leading in a bad direction. What he's implying here, that we can ignore nutritional epidemiology, which is basically what he's going to end up saying, or what he wants to suggest, is that we shouldn't trust nutritional epidemiology. It's not a good argument that he's making. All right, that's not a good reason to ignore nutritional epidemiology. Okay. Well, let's say he's not making that argument. Let's just look at what references he uses. So I actually have these pulled up. So I found this on the website of I think McGraw or something like that, the publisher. And the three references he uses is one from Yannidis, another from Casaza et al., and another from Young and Carr. Let us now look at these papers that he cites. So the first one is by Yannidis, John Yannidis, the famous John Yannidis at Stanford. Very well established, well respected, or was well respected before COVID, but I still respect him. I think many people still respect him as a researcher. It's an editorial called Implausible Results in Human Nutrition Research. So let's be very clear. What is an editorial? An editorial is it's not peer reviewed. Okay. It's not a peer reviewed paper. It's just an opinion that Yannidis wrote for the BMJ. Maybe they invited him. Maybe he had this idea to write the editorial. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but here are this editorial, and it's like 5 paragraphs long. Okay. It's like 5 paragraphs long, and it looks pretty hastily written to me. It's very polemical. And it's not even peer reviewed, right? And it's just his opinions about nutritional epidemiology, how we can't trust nutritional epidemiology, but it just says, and I'm not going to read this whole paper for you because we're supposed to be debunking Paul's chapter, but it says that sometimes nutritional epidemiology is wrong, right? Nutritional epidemiology can be wrong. And in this case, he wants to strongly imply that we shouldn't trust nutritional epidemiology in much the same way that Paul does. But this paper is an editorial. It's not peer-reviewed. So this is the quality of research that Paul's using. Now, if he had a really rigorous publication that he cited, but this is just John Yannidis' opinion. It's fine. It's fine to have an opinion, but it's not a peer-reviewed, serious scientific paper. So that's funny. So Paul is now citing people's opinion papers. Okay, that's okay. But it's not a good citation. It's a bad citation. All right. Well, okay, fine. Okay, fine. He cites an opinion paper. Let's look at this next paper that Paul cites, and it's by Casaza, Fontaine, and Astrup. It's called Myths, Presumptions, and Facts About Obesity. Let's look at it. It's from the New England Journal of Medicine. It should be good, right? Yeah, I mean, it's by like the leaders in the field. That's great. It's like David Allison is the final author. Barbara Rolls is on it. There's like a lot of really top people on here. This is great. Okay, cool. Like we can see this. But here's the thing: is like myths, presumptions, and facts about obesity. Wait, I thought this is about nutrition science and epidemiology that he's citing this about. But this is about myths about obesity. So this is confusing because isn't he talking about how randomized controlled trials and epidemiology often don't match? But this paper actually doesn't support that. This is about, look, here's the methods. Using internet searches of popular media and scientific literature, we identified, reviewed, and classified obesity-related myths and presumptions. We also examined facts that are well supported with evidence, with an emphasis on those that have been practical implications for public health policy and clinical recommendations. This is about obesity. This is not even about nutrition, right? And it's about like popular beliefs. And it's like about some things in the scientific literature. Let's look at some of these myths that are discussed. I believe it's 7. They go 7 myths. Small sustained changes in energy intake or expenditure will produce large long-term weight changes. Well, that's not based on nutritional epidemiology. Setting realistic goals in obesity treatment is important because otherwise patients will become frustrated or lose less weight. Again, not based on nutritional epidemiology. Large, rapid weight loss is associated with poor long-term weight outcomes than is slow, gradual weight loss. This actually is based on epidemiology, but this is not based on nutritional epidemiology. And some of the best controlled epidemiology on this actually shows the opposite. So it depends on what epidemiology we're talking about. You have to actually very carefully look at the literature here. So again, it's not nutritional epidemiology, it's obesity epidemiology, and even the obesity epidemiology is complex. And the best epidemiology suggests that this isn't true. Okay, fine. Assessing the stage of change or diet readiness is important in helping patients who seek weight loss treatment. Again, this is not based on nutrition and epidemiology. Physical education classes in their current format play an important role in preventing or reducing childhood obesity. It's not based on nutritional epidemiology, okay? Breastfeeding is protective against obesity. It's not based on nutritional epidemiology. And a bout of sexual activity burns 200 to 300 calories for each person involved, not based on nutritional epidemiology. So why is he citing this paper? It's not about nutritional epidemiology at all. It's about things about obesity and most of them is not based on epidemiology. And even the things that are based on epidemiology are complex and have a complex discussion about them. Why is he citing this paper at all? That's interesting. So one paper is an editorial. One paper is it's not about nutritional epidemiology. So his citations are wrong. What about the third reference? Young, Carr, and Deming. Okay, let's go here. Young, Carr. Sorry, it's not even Carr and Deming. It's Young, Carr, and then the paper's called Deming Data and Observational Studies. It's published in the journal Significance, whatever that is. Deming Data and Observational Studies. Who's Stanley Young and Alan Carr anyway? It's so they have. They have 12 claims about vitamin E. Actually, it's almost all about vitamin E. It's like literally four of the studies are about vitamin E. Let's just read this. We found 12 papers in which claims coming from observational studies were tested in randomized controlled trials. Many of the trials are quite large. In most of the observational studies, multiple claims were tested, often factorial designs of vitamin D and calcium individually and together along with the placebo group. Note that none of the claims replicated in the direction claimed in the observational studies. The statistical significance is the opposite direction 5 times. So they picked out of the scientific literature 12 randomized controlled trials. They found 12 randomized controlled trials. Most of them, at least 5 addressed vitamin E, right? Several addressed vitamin C, 2 addressed vitamin C, a few other vitamins, hormone replacement therapy was addressed too. So there's like 4 different topics. That's it, 4 different questions. And they found randomized controlled trials showing that on these 4 different questions or so, a few, maybe more than 4, but there are 4 different questions, 5 different questions. The nutritional epidemiology was different from the randomized controlled trials. Well, here's the problem here. These are just randomly picked studies, or maybe even these are cherry picked to show the point. So yeah, none of the studies were confirmed. The observational studies were confirmed by randomized controlled trials, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how observational studies are with respect to randomized controlled trials. It could be that this particular set of topics, like 4 or 5 different topics, is particularly bad with respect to being confirmed by randomized controlled trials. But other topics in nutrition and nutritional epidemiology don't have the same problem. How do we know that? We don't, because this isn't a systematic paper. These trials very well could have been cherry picked. And if you look at the methods, they don't talk about the methods by which they chose these trials. They just criticize these trials. And for whatever reason, like, they didn't decide to do a systematic review. Isn't that a shame? But here's the interesting thing. It gets more interesting because this systematic review is actually conducted. So this is published in 2011, and in 2013, they actually did carry out a systematic review. Wow, isn't that something? They carried it out at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. It's called The Concordance Between the Findings of Epidemiological Studies and Randomized Controlled Trials in Nutrition. Wow, it's exactly the question. An empirical evaluation and citation analysis. Well, what is it? What are the results? Findings in 23 out of 34 of the association's summary findings for meta-analyses of epidemiological studies and randomized controlled trials were in the same direction. 2/3 are in the same direction. Now, it gets more complicated than that, but that beats the hell out of 50%. Only 11 out of 34 were pointing in the opposite direction. Okay? And there have been more studies conducted since then by Lucas Schwing-Schackel and others. There's several different studies actually that have been published recently showing that the concordance between nutritional epidemiology and randomized controlled trials is pretty decent. It's pretty decent. Okay? And if it beats 50%, then it's still providing more signal than noise. Okay? But interestingly, he never cites this paper. It was available here. This is published in 2019. Why didn't he cite this paper? He cites an editorial. He cites a paper on about obesity, had nothing to do with nutritional and epidemiology. And then he cites another paper where they cherry pick epidemiological studies. So already he's misusing certain citations. In the case of the second citation, in the case of the first citation, he's using a reference that's not very rigorous. It's an editorial. It certainly shouldn't be used by itself to buttress his claim. And then the third reference is a cherry-picked reference. It's not a systematic review. And then he leaves out a systematic review. I would say this amounts to 4 separate errors. Now, we could be generous and say it's like 2, but I would say this is 4 separate errors. He doesn't look at all the evidence that's available, including the most systematic treatment of the subject available. He cites an editorial, which he should be citing that for a strong claim. He miscites another paper that doesn't have anything to do with nutritional epidemiology. And then he cites a cherry-picked review, right? It's not a good citation. We could call that maybe not an error, but maybe not the best citation. So 4 problems and just 3 citations in 1 sentence. And then the sentence itself is misleading because what does it mean that observational studies are often demonstrated to be erroneous when tested against in randomized controlled trials? I haven't even discussed about the difference between randomized controlled trials and observational studies that maybe some of our listeners aren't even able to follow. And it may be already too late, but let's give that to a couple people. So an observational study is you just look at a population, see how it does over time based on certain characteristics it has. Say some people eat bread, some people don't eat bread. How do they do in terms of their health outcomes? Do some people get more heart attacks if they don't eat bread? Or do they get fewer heart attacks if they don't eat bread? And vice versa. That's an observational study. And a randomized control trial actually gives people bread or no bread and then sees how they do. Well, the problem with observational studies is that people who eat bread might have different characteristics than people who don't eat bread that may have nothing to do with the bread eating that may cause the heart disease outcome. So you have these confounders. So there's a less strong study design. In a nutshell, that is the difference between nutritional epidemiology and observational studies. And that's the issue he's talking about here. But if overall these observational studies are well controlled, they have good statistical methods, et cetera, and they tend to provide a better signal than not, then they can still be useful. So he doesn't talk about that side of things. He only talks about the negative side. It's often, quote unquote, often demonstrated to be erroneous when tested in randomized controlled trials. Well, that's not helpful. And he's saying that it's based on less robust epidemiological research. Yeah, it's less robust. But what's the other side? What's the other alternative to using this less robust? Let's just hang this question here because it's going to get more interesting over time, because he's going to reject a lot of nutritional epidemiology selectively. Actually, I can't go through all of that because this is going to take, again, it's going to take hundreds of hours to do this. But let me just point out that what he does in his book chapter is he uses some epidemiological studies to make his case that agree with him, and then he leaves out all the ones that don't. And he does that because he thinks he's allowed to do that because nutritional epidemiology is sometimes wrong. But how does that make any sense if nutritional epidemiology is sometimes wrong? Therefore, use some nutritional epidemiology that agree with you, but not others? How is that consistent? Why don't you use all of it or none of it? Why don't you systematically evaluate the nutritional epidemiology? Those are some other errors. I'm not able to get to them, or some other inconsistencies. I'm not able to get to them. But they point to this overall overarching tendency in this work to take references that agree with this point of view, use them, and don't use the references that don't agree with this point of view. It doesn't matter how high quality the references that do agree with this point of view are, so long as they agree. And then what matters to him is just that they agree. And if something disagrees with this particular opinion, all that matters to him is that it disagrees, and so he doesn't use it, even if it's the higher quality reference. Even if it's the higher quality reference. So the highest quality reference he could have possibly used here, he didn't use. And that's the tendency in this paper, in this book chapter. That's what I'm pointing to. Not only are there errors, and there's like, why did he do this? Why did he do that? If you think about it in the broad strokes of what he's trying to achieve here, which is just to promote his point of view, you see very clearly why he's made these mistakes. And they're not mistakes. Okay, they follow certain logic. Now, do I think he's consciously carrying out this logic? I don't know. But the book chapter follows this logic and explains his errors. That's why he's making these errors. Okay, fine. Let's go on to the next sentence. And in recent years, there has been a growing interest in nutrition research thanks to increased funding and improved research methodologies. I don't know if there's increased funding, brother, but okay. Improve research methodology. Well, anyway, combined with advancements in molecular biology and biochemistry, this has resulted in improved understanding of healthy diets and underlying physiological mechanisms. These new understandings, however, often contrast with existing orthodoxy and are not universally accepted. This is nonsense. This is just nonsense. Like, what is he even talking about? He has no citation here. He's just like saying that new advances are being made that challenge the orthodoxy. And this is based in biochemistry and molecular biology. And the orthodoxy is not accepting these, which is based on epidemiology. Basically, he's saying that. It's like, this is nonsense. Where is he even getting this from? Optimal dietary macronutrient composition is perhaps most contentious. Yeah, because, okay. So he's saying that these advances are with respect to optimal dietary macronutrient composition in biochemistry and molecular biology, and there's no such advances. Sugar has received much attention, many arguing it has increased potential for causing metabolic harms compared to other carbohydrates. Yeah, free sugars, maybe, like in sugar-sweetened beverages. Yeah, sure. Okay. The importance of sodium restriction, benefits of dietary fiber and required water intake are other longstanding beliefs that have been increasingly questioned. No, actually, I think sodium restriction is, or at least, replacement of sodium with potassium is very well established at this point now, in very rigorous randomized controlled trials. I think this is actually false. So I think, again, another error with respect to sodium restriction. I think it's categorically false. I don't think there's any question about sodium restriction. For heart failure and other applications, sure, yeah, you have some other discussions, but as an overall public health measure, sodium restriction, especially the replacement of sodium with potassium, is a very well-established public health measure for reducing blood pressure and stroke and cardiovascular disease risk. No question. And it's more and more strong with each and every year in each and every randomized controlled trial, including the recent one in China that I discussed in a recent podcast on the topic in an earlier one. Okay, dietary fiber. I don't think anybody's questioning dietary fiber, brother. I don't think anybody's questioning that. And he's saying the gut microbiome is an exciting new area of nutrition science. Now he's jumping into gut microbiome. Okay, whatever. Yeah, it is exciting. However, many claims regarding prebiotics and probiotics are being made in advance of definite evidence. I actually firmly agree with this. The one sentence that's very clear and it's correct. Yeah, yes, prebiotics, probiotics is nonsense. A lot of that stuff is nonsense, and it's way in advance. And microbiome research is a total disaster mess. And these are actually the latest molecular biology and biochemical advances being made in microbiome researches, and a lot of it's nonsense. It's not challenging the orthodoxy. None of that's challenging the orthodoxy, okay? So if that's related to that previous paragraph, that's nonsense. Again, we could count that up as an error, right? And certainly these controversies about sodium restriction, dietary fiber, and required water intake is not being done on the basis of molecular biology and biochemistry advances. So if that's the implication, that's another error. It's not true. It's simply false. Or maybe these two paragraphs are not connected. I don't know. Then why do you have that paragraph before this paragraph? What does this paragraph connect? Like, what is the argument he's making here? Or is he just stringing together random sentences? So is that an error, or is it just like his prose is incoherent? I'm not really sure. But like, if he's saying that these controversies are being had because of advances in molecular biology and biochemistry, that's false. It's just completely false. And many of these are not controversies, also false. So we're like at 8 or 9 or 10. I think we're exceeding 10 errors here already in the first 3 paragraphs, right? Some things just don't make sense. Some things are false. And that's excluding the vague statements, right? That you can't know whether they're erroneous or not because they're so vague. Right, but we got this good one regarding the prebiotics and probiotics stuff. Yeah, that's correct. It's being made in definite advance of definite evidence. Absolutely, I agree with Paul here, 100%. Okay, he goes, a significant amount of conventional thinking about nutrition is not well supported by evidence. What does that mean, not well supported by evidence? That's like a blanket statement that is kind of like silly. It's like, okay, what is evidence and what does well supported mean? Yeah, if you're talking about randomized controlled trials, yeah, nothing in nutrition is really well supported by randomized controlled trials, man. We have almost no long-term evidence in randomized controlled trials for nutrition. You have almost nothing. But we have a lot of epidemiology. We have a lot of animal studies. We have a lot of short-term biomarker studies. We have a lot of Mendelian randomization. We have some long-term randomized controlled trials. And we use those studies to inform our understanding of nutrition. And that's what we have to do because that's the best signal we got. If you say it's not well supported, but you need to really clarify what you mean here. Does he clarify what he means? If he doesn't, then he's just making a blanket statement that's not supported by an evidence. I would call that another error. It's like he's asserting things that are not supported. He's making strong claims, polemical claims that are misleading, that are not correctly qualified and discussed, that are going to cause people to come to wrong conclusions without evidence. So he says, In this chapter, we will examine the evidence base for current nutrition recommendations by exploring the current understanding of macronutrients, micronutrients, fluids, and different dietary patterns. So he doesn't actually support that claim that a significant amount of conventional thinking about nutrition is not well supported by evidence. He just makes it. It's just his opinion. This is just his opinion. And he should just say, in our opinion, right? He states it as if it's a fact. It's not a fact. It's not a fact. This is his opinion. And stating something that's an opinion as if it's a fact is misleading. It's false. That's a false, he's misleading people into believing that his opinion is a fact. It's kind of a kind of lying. I would say as far as science is concerned, and science is concerned with truth, it's an error. Again, it's an error. It's an error because he doesn't explain what he means. It's an error because he's not saying something that is an opinion as a fact. It's an error because it's misleading people into believing something that may not be true. It's not supported by anything. He's not showing these strong claims. He's not supporting them. They're not well supported. This wouldn't do well with a really rigorous and hard PhD committee. He would get killed by this. We can go on to the rest, man. We can go on to the rest. But the whole chapter's like this. It's not just the first paragraph, the first section. The whole chapter's this way. And I didn't want to do this. I don't want to do this. But if he thinks that this is still wrong, this is not enough, that I've still not done my job, this is going to be part one. We'll go do part two. I'm going to send this to him. And if he doesn't think it's legitimate enough to warrant, his taking seriously and talk to me about his LDL article, then we'll do another the next section, or we can debate it. We can debate it in live. We can debate this whole thing live. Me and him can debate it live or discuss it. I don't want to debate it. I want to discuss it with him. Like, why did he write these things? It just seems totally wrong to me to write this way. It's like it just seems wrong. Now, again, I don't want to point this out because I don't do these kinds of videos anymore usually. I just don't care about this stuff. But I want to discuss his LDL paper. He's saying I can't discuss it until I talk about this nutrition science chapter. This nutrition science chapter is not nutrition science. It's just a chapter of errors and misleading statements. And very partial, partisan takes on things that are not scientific. Hundreds of statements like this in this chapter. And at the very least, we could say this is just a difference in opinion, and that's fine. We can do that, and that's okay. But he should be very clear that this is his opinion. This isn't fact. But he's purporting this chapter is written polemically as if it's a fact when it's just his opinion. Which is just wrong. It's just freaking wrong. It's just wrong to write that way. That's like a kind of lying, in my opinion. So, hope you guys liked the video. We'll do part two if this isn't acceptable to him. We'll do a part two. Peace out, brothers. Brothers.
I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please check me out on patreon.com at Kevin and Bass, where you can donate and make this podcast possible. Also check me out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where you can find my latest thoughts on the latest controversies and findings within health science. Also check me out at The Kevin Bass Show, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I hope this podcast was useful to you. If it was, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. See you guys in the next episode.